There are few objects more sacred, more intimate than the human skull. It is the vessel that holds thought and memory, the chamber of the senses, the fragile house of the soul. Or so it was once believed. To tamper with the skull, to carve into it, to open it, such an act would seem to us today as the last resort of desperate medicine, or perhaps even desecration. But long, long ago, far before antibiotics, before anesthesia, before metal scalpels or sterile fields, there were those who did just that. And what they did not in ignorance, but in quiet, practiced purpose. We begin tonight not in the era of great empires, not in Egypt, nor Greece, nor Rome, but far earlier, thousands of years earlier, in the deep stillness of Neolithic Europe. Imagine the world now not bustling with cities but softened with silence. The distant crackle of fire, the creak of wind through wooden huts, herds of animals moving slowly across wide open plains. A world lit not by screens or electricity but by flame. A world in which knowledge is passed down by touch, by gaze, by patient repetition. And somewhere in this world, a quiet figure leans over another, resting, perhaps unconscious, on a bed of furs or woven reeds. A tool, not of steel but of sharpened stone, is lifted gently in hand. And then a hole is cut into the skull. Not with violence, not without care, but with a knowing that feels, even now, difficult to explain. This is trepanation, a word we use today for an ancient practice, the removal of a portion of the skull, most often by scraping, drilling, or cutting, to create a round or oval opening in the cranial bone. It is not random. It is not chaotic. It is measured, deliberate, methodical. But why? Why would a people without modern medicine, without microscopes, without even metal tools, attempt such a delicate and dangerous act? What did they hope to find, or release, within the sacred chamber of the mind? We begin to find traces of this practice as far back as 7,000 years ago, possibly more. In modern-day France, the Ensisheim skull was discovered, bearing a circular hole near the top of the head. But this was not the wound of a weapon. There are no signs of crushing, no fracture patterns of violence. What we see is something else entirely. A clean, well-defined hole. And around its edge, a miracle of sorts. Bone regrowth. Healing. This was not the skull of the dead, but of someone who had lived, perhaps for months, perhaps even years, after this procedure was done. And this is not the only case. Across Germany, Ukraine, Czechia, and the Balkans, archaeologists have found dozens, even hundreds, of similar skulls. Men, women, and even children. The trepanned. Sometimes a single hole, sometimes more than one. Sometimes circular, sometimes rectangular. Some located near the top of the skull, others closer to the temple or the occipital ridge. And almost always there is evidence of survival. This in itself is startling. Imagine, if you will, attempting to operate on the skull of a living person with a tool no more advanced than obsidian, flint, or deer bone. Imagine doing so without antiseptic, without anesthesia, without any knowledge of germ theory or blood types or blood pressure. Yet these ancient practitioners succeeded, not once but many times. How? There are theories. Some suggest that their tools, while primitive, were sharper than one might assume. Obsidian, in fact, can be honed to an edge far finer than even surgical steel, so sharp it can slice between cells. Others note that ancient lifestyles, often more communal and less industrial, may have protected patients from the bacterial threats that plague modern surgery. But these are only partial answers. They do not explain the knowledge of where to cut, or how deep, or how to avoid the great vessels of the brain, the sagittal sinus, the meningeal arteries, whose damage would spell certain death even today. And then there is the greater mystery still. Why was trepanation performed? Some argue that it was a response to head trauma, a way to relieve cranial pressure after an injury. And this makes sense in part. Some of the skulls do show signs of pre-existing fractures or injuries, and the trepanation seems to correspond with these wounds, perhaps to relieve swelling or clean infection. But then there are skulls with no trauma, no signs of injury at all. Yet the hole is there, perfectly placed with care and again healed. This is where medicine and mysticism begin to blur. In some cultures, it is believed that trepanation was performed not to heal the body, but to affect the soul, to release spirits, bad or good, to relieve the pressure not of blood but of thought, of dreams, of visions, perhaps of madness. There are accounts from later tribal groups, in Africa, in Polynesia, and in South America, where trepanation was practiced by shamans to rid the body of dark forces, of intrusive thoughts, or of divine possession. Could this be true of these ancient people as well? Or were these openings meant to allow something in, not out? A channel perhaps to the divine? A way to allow the gods to speak more clearly to the mind? The truth may lie somewhere in between. One might imagine an ancient healer observing a person in distress, suffering seizures or erratic behavior or intense headaches. With no word for neurology, no concept of epilepsy or mental illness, the healer interprets this as a spiritual wound, a blockage, a pressure of spirits or thoughts. And so they open the skull just slightly, just enough, and the person survives and improves. Word spreads. The technique is passed down, refined. And so trepanation begins. A quiet tradition, part medicine, part ritual, that stretches across generations. We might be tempted to dismiss such beliefs today, to label them as superstition. But pause for a moment. Consider that even in modern medicine, we perform procedures that echo this ancient act. To relieve pressure from brain swelling, to place electrodes for neural recording, to remove tumors, to implant shunts. The difference is only one of tools and explanation. The act is the same, entering the sacred vault of the skull to restore balance. But where our world looks for circuits and chemicals, there's looked for spirits and symbols. And in this, perhaps they were not wrong. For the mind, however we define it, is more than just matter. It is a mystery. And these early people, living in quiet communities by the rivers and forests of Neolithic Europe, may have honored that mystery more deeply than we know. We find in their graves not just skulls but care. Some are buried with amulets, others with tools, some with evidence that they were respected, perhaps even revered in life. Could it be that those who performed these surgeries were not seen as butchers, but as guides? As the wise ones, the bone knowers? There are no writings from this time, no surviving text to tell us what they thought or believed. But the skulls remain. Dozens, hundreds. A silent record of something both lost and remembered. And they speak, not in words but in the slow spiraling patterns of healing bone. in the precision of their edges, in the consistent placement. They whisper of something we may have forgotten, a kind of knowing, kind of care, an understanding of the body not as a machine, but as a vessel, one that could be opened, not to destroy but to restore. As the fires of early Europe flickered in the night, and shadows danced along cave walls, someone once leaned over another, with flint in hand and purpose in heart, and made a small, deliberate window into the mind. We do not know their names. We do not know their prayers. But we know they succeeded. And in that success there is a question that still lingers. If you listen carefully, not with ears but with attention, you can still hear them. The whispers of mountains, the breath of the highlands, the slow, steady pulse of civilizations that once lived among the clouds. Here in what is now Peru and Bolivia, long before the Spanish ships ever broke the horizon of the Pacific, people walked with knowledge in their hands, knowledge of stars, of irrigation, of time, and of the human skull. They lived not at sea level but in thin air, in the sacred altitudes where clouds touched soil. And it is here, perhaps because of that closeness to the heavens, that they reach deep into the mysteries of the mind. This is the land of the Paracas, the Nazca, the Wari, and the Inca. And among the many things they left behind, geoglyphs etched into deserts, temples balanced on stone, gold masks, and woven mantles, they left something quieter, something more intimate. Skulls, not just buried and forgotten, but modified, marked, and sometimes opened. Let us begin with the Paracas culture. Emerging around 1000 BCE on the southern coast of Peru, the Paracas people were weavers of extraordinary textiles, makers of ritual vessels, and notably, masters of skull surgery. In ancient burial sites like Cerro Colorado and Cabeza Larga, archaeologists have unearthed hundreds of trepan skulls. Not crude hacks but smooth, rounded openings, some as small as a coin, others as wide as a plum. Some skulls show multiple surgeries, done years apart. But here is the quiet miracle again. Healing. The bone regrows. The edges thicken. The person, whoever they were, survived. And not just once. In some Paracas cemeteries, over 40% of trepanned individuals show signs of healing. This is astonishing. In modern field surgery during wartime, survival rates were often far lower, even with antiseptic and anesthesia. And what tools did they use? Not stainless steel, not carbon fiber, but obsidian, volcanic glass, razor-sharp, delicate, and, in skilled hands, a tool of wonder. Paracas surgeons used obsidian blades to carefully scrape or drill the cranial bone. They understood how to avoid the sagittal sinus. They worked slowly, methodically. But even more remarkable is who these surgeries were performed on. Often the skulls showed deliberate elongation, cranial shaping that began in infancy. 2 boards or pads would be strapped to the head of a newborn, gently shaping the skull as it grew. The result was dramatic. A long, upward-stretched cranium, almost otherworldly in form. But why go to such lengths to alter the human head? There are clues, though never clear answers. Among the Paracas and later the Nazca and Inca, elongated skulls were a sign of status, of difference, perhaps even divinity. In many indigenous cultures, the head was considered the seat of the spirit. To reshape it may have been to signal closeness to the gods, to set apart the priestly class or the leaders, or those believed to carry wisdom from beyond. And so the question arises, were the trepanations and the elongations connected? Did the same individuals, the spiritually altered, the elongated, also receive surgical intervention? Was there something about these people or their perceived state of being that called for such procedures? When we examine skulls from wary sites, dating to around 600 to 1000 CE, we see a continuity and an evolution. More than 700 trepan skulls have been found in wary associated regions. Some show meticulous technique, circular cuts, beveled edges, and again, evidence of bone regrowth. Among the wary, 2 elongated skulls are present. The practice by this time had become institutional, passed down over generations. But what's most striking is the variation of technique. Some trepanations are done through scraping, others through drilling. Some are rectangular, some oval. Yet despite this variation, the survival rate remains high. This suggests not experimentation but refinement. A surgical tradition being handed down, perhaps taught among a class of healers or priests. And there is a quiet spiritual layer here as well. In Andean cosmology, the head was not just anatomical, it was cosmic. The head faced the sky. It dreamed. It received visions. The skull then was a kind of antenna, a place where the physical and metaphysical met. Some theories suggest that trepanation was done to release pressure, not just of fluid, but of energy, to balance what the Andeans called Sami, the sacred life force. If someone was suffering from what we might now call seizures, hallucinations, or madness, it might have been interpreted as a disruption of spiritual flow. Opening the skull was a way to restore harmony. And yet, once again, we must be careful not to over-romanticize. Some trepanations clearly were for trauma. Skull fractures, perhaps from war or accidents, are cleaned and surrounded by surgical openings. Others, perhaps, were to relieve infection or abscesses. But the overlap between the medical and the ritual is where this chapter breathes. Because the Andean people did not separate these realms. To heal the body was also to heal the soul. To shape the skull was not a cosmetic act, but a spiritual one. To open the skull was not simply to fix, but to transform. And what of the Inca, the last great civilization before the Spanish arrived? Though they inherited much from the wary and others, they too practiced trepanation. At Cusco, at Sacsayhuaman, and in the surrounding highlands, Inca burial sites reveal more trepan skulls. Some were warriors, the victims of blunt trauma. But others bear no wound, only the surgical hole. And still again, they lived. What's more, the rate of successful healing among Inca trepanations exceeds 80% in some studies. This is extraordinary. These were not the fumblings of superstition, but the actions of knowing hands. Hands that had learned across centuries how to touch the brain, and not break it. We might wonder, did they understand the brain as we do? Unlikely. There is no evidence of anatomical dissection. No surviving texts explaining the cerebrum, the meninges, the vascular system. But they knew somehow what not to touch. They had rules. They had traditions. Perhaps they had rituals before surgery. Prayers, smoke, songs. Perhaps patients were given coca leaves to chew, or hallucinogenic herbs to ease the pain. Perhaps there was singing. Perhaps the one who performed the act did not do so alone, but with guardians, both earthly and unseen, by their side. We do not know. But the skulls speak. They whisper through their patterns of regrowth. They show us where the blade stopped. They show us where the wound healed. And they raise one question more. Could this practice, passed from Paracas to Nazca, from Nazca to Wari, from Wari to Inca, Be part of something older still? A memory held not in books but in bone. The act of opening the skull as a sacred inheritance. A ritual taught not understood. Repeated not questioned. Passed down like a song even when the meaning had begun to fade. Could these Andean people have been preserving something? A sliver of knowledge from a culture even older now vanished? We may never know. But the patterns suggest it. The consistency across thousands of years. The precision with Stone Age tools. The selectivity favoring certain skulls. Elongated, rare, altered. And the healing. Always the healing. These were not the acts of trial and error. They were echoes. Echoes of a science or a belief or a blend of both. Long gone but not entirely lost. Now as you sit in stillness, as you breathe and let your thoughts drift like smoke into air, imagine that highland world once more. The quiet wind through woven reed homes. The smell of earth and fire. A stone table. A healer in soft robes. A patient lying still, trusting, waiting. A prayer whispered in Quechua. A tool of black glass. A slow circle drawn on bone. Not to harm. Not to kill. But to open. To release. To remember. In the silent heights of the Andes where clouds cradle stone, something sacred once happened, again and again. And the skulls resting now in museum drawers and sacred caves are not remains. They are messages. Still speaking. Still waiting. Still glowing with the quiet memory of hands that knew what they were doing. There are places on this earth where time feels different. Where the light moves more slowly. Where the air is heavy with memory. And where even now one can almost hear the hush of prayers whispered through centuries of sand and stone. Ancient Egypt, the land of lotus and limestone, of stars aligned with tombs, and of souls weighed on celestial scales. It is here, among painted walls and long-buried scrolls, that we find not just myth and monument, but something softer, quieter, more human. We find healing, medicine, and a rare sacred act, the opening of the human skull. In truth, trepanation in Egypt was uncommon, far less frequent than in the Andes or Neolithic Europe. And yet, when it appears, it matters. Because here it carries the weight not only of physical treatment but of cosmic consequence. Let us begin in the still corridors of a tomb. Imagine a body, carefully prepared, wrapped in fine linen, face painted perhaps, charms nestled beneath the arms, and beneath the linen, beneath the bone, a hole. Deliberate, precise, circular. This is not the mark of violence, nor of decay. It is trepanation, likely performed before death, and possibly by one trained in the arts of both medicine and the divine. But to understand this act in Egypt, we must move beyond the tomb, to the temple, to the school, to the papyrus scroll, because Egypt was, in many ways, one of the birthplaces of recorded medicine. The Edwin Smith Papyrus, dating to around 1600 BCE, is often called the world's oldest surgical text. It is not poetic, not mythic. It is calm, structured, clinical. And in it we read of skull fractures, head wounds, and methods of treatment. There are instructions for diagnosis, for observation, even for prognosis. He has a gaping wound in his skull reaching to the bone. You shall say, "This is a case I can heal," or "This is a case I cannot heal." What is most astonishing is that these ancient physicians, who worked in an age of incense and amulets, also understood the brain. They describe its consistency, its pulsation, its connection to movement and speech. They even use a word that may be the first recorded reference to cerebrospinal fluid. All of this, over 3,500 years ago. They did not know the names we use today. They had no MRI, no scalpel. And yet they watched. They learned. They remembered. In some Egyptian tombs, particularly among the elite, archaeologists have found trepaned skulls, often with signs of healing. The implication is clear. The surgery was done before death and the person survived. But we cannot say with certainty. But among the elite, priests, scribes, nobles, the act of opening the skull may have served a dual purpose. One, perhaps medical, to relieve pressure after injury. But also perhaps spiritual. For in Egyptian thought, the body was a vessel for multiple parts of the soul. The Ka, the Ba, the Rin, the Shit, and the Ib, the heart. But interestingly, not the brain. The brain was not traditionally seen as the seat of the soul. And yet, they preserved it. Sometimes it was removed during mummification and discarded. But in rare cases it was treated with care. Was this a late development? Or were some priests beginning to recognize the mind's sacred role? In depictions of healing rituals, we often see priest-physicians, known as Sunu, mixing both herbs and hymns. They treated wounds and called upon Thoth, god of wisdom and knowledge, to guide their hands. The surgical act was not just physical, it was ritual. To cut the skin was to disturb the balance of Ma'at, cosmic harmony. So to open the skull, that was a bold act. And only the trusted, the trained could do it. And only, it seems, on those whose bodies were already marked as sacred. The chosen, the afflicted, or the anointed. From Egypt we move east, across the desert winds and rivers of time, to Mesopotamia. To the land of the Sumerians, the Akkadians, the Babylonians. And here too we find a world of healing, not from stone tablets but from clay ones. The Diagnostic Handbook of the Babylonian healer describes symptoms that modern doctors would recognize. Seizures, paralysis, loss of speech. They did not perform trepanation as commonly, or at least we have little evidence that they did. But they wrote with startling clarity about the mind. They observed its changes. They charted its diseases. And they too, like the Egyptians, saw illness as a blend of body and spirit. Evil winds, curses, divine punishment, but also imbalance, tension, misalignment. To cure the mind was to restore order. Though they may not have cut the skull open, they spoke of it. And they likely knew, from battle wounds, from accidental injuries, that a blow to the head could change a person's speech, their movement, even their soul. One can imagine the quiet awe with which they regarded such a change. And the careful debate, should one dare to touch the seat of consciousness? In some early Hebrew texts and in Talmudic commentary centuries later, there are discussions of cranial injury. They do not describe surgery, but they describe reverence. The head is sacred, the skull a crown. To alter it, even to anoint it, is not done lightly. And yet healing was central to these cultures. The physician in these lands was not just a craftsman, but a mediator. Between body and spirit, between illness and purity, between man and the divine. So if trepanation was done, and it likely was, if rarely, it was done only when all else had failed. And only with the care of one who knew they were touching more than just flesh. They were touching the threshold between being and non-being, between breath and silence. Back in Egypt, we return once more to the image of the surgeon priest. A linen-clad figure, hands washed, blade of obsidian in hand. Beside him incense burns. A chant is murmured in a tongue now long lost. And the patient lies still, surrounded by amulets. Above them a small opening is made in the bone. Not violently, not quickly, but with the patience of centuries. Because this was not experimentation. It was memory. Perhaps the priest had learned the technique from another, who had learned it from their teacher, who had learned it not from books but from bone, from the skulls of the past. We think of Egypt as a civilization of death, of tombs and mummies and golden coffins. But perhaps it was, too, a civilization of preservation, of life prolonged, of understanding recorded, and of healing, both seen and unseen. The few skulls they trepanned tell us this. They knew the risks, and still they dared. Not out of ignorance, but out of reverence. The reverence of hands that knew they were trespassing into a realm guarded by gods. The realm of the mind. In the lands surrounding the sparkling waters of the Aegean Sea, a quiet revolution in the understanding of the human body was unfolding. Ancient Greece, with its philosophers and seekers of knowledge, was beginning to view the body not just as a vessel of spirit but as a subject worthy of careful study and gentle healing. Among the many discoveries, one stands apart: the delicate art of cranial surgery. Long before antiseptics and anesthesia, before modern hospitals and sterile instruments, the surgeons of Greece dared to open the skull with tools forged of bronze and hands steady from years of practice. One of the earliest known voices to speak with clarity and care about such practices was Hippocrates, a physician who lived around the 5th century BCE on the island of Kos. He is often called the father of medicine, not merely for his wisdom but for his method. A call to observe, to listen, and to respect the patient. In his writings, part of the Hippocratic corpus, we find descriptions of head injuries that are surprisingly modern in their approach. For Hippocrates, the head was a place of immense importance, a seat of thought, sensation, and life itself. His texts describe skull fractures and the necessity, in some cases, of trepanation, the surgical removal of a piece of the skull bone to relieve pressure or to remove damaged tissue. This was not a casual or reckless act. It required precision, patience, and, above all, knowledge. In the battlefield, where spear and stone clashed against bronze armor and bone, soldiers returned with wounds that challenged even the most skilled healer. The surgeon's task was daunting: to clean the wound, to remove bone splinters, and sometimes to open the skull to prevent further damage. Imagine for a moment the tools at their disposal. A bronze scalpel, sharp and gleaming. A drill carefully turned by hand. No electricity, no anesthesia. Only the steady hands of the surgeon and the whispered prayers of the patient. Pain was real, but so was hope. For in these acts lay the chance to save a life, to preserve the mind, to keep a warrior's thoughts intact, his speech clear. The Hippocratic texts also include warnings, advice to the surgeon to watch for signs of infection or excessive bleeding. They recommend gentle techniques to avoid worsening the injury. These words reveal a profound understanding, a respect for the fragility of the brain beneath the hard skull. Centuries later, the Roman Empire embraced and expanded upon Greek medical knowledge. Among its many physicians, none was more renowned than Galen of Pergamon, who lived during the 2nd century CE. Galen's contributions to anatomy and surgery would shape medical thought for over 1,000 years. Though forbidden by custom from dissecting human bodies, Galen learned anatomy through careful observation of animals, combined with keen insight. His writings described the brain's ventricles, fluid-filled cavities, and the membranes that surround it. He identified cranial nerves and their connection to sensation and movement. In his surgical treatises, Galen detailed techniques for cranial surgery that emphasized caution and skill. He described how to use drills and scalpels to create openings in the skull, how to clean wounds, how to bandage carefully to prevent infection. In the military hospitals, known as valetudinaria, Roman surgeons applied these methods to wounded soldiers. Injuries from battle were frequent and brutal. Broken helmets, shattered shields, blows to the head that could mean death or lasting disability. It was in these places of healing that the art of trepanation was practiced with increasing sophistication. Imagine a Roman battlefield surgeon. Clad in simple linen, he works quickly but carefully. The patient lies on a wooden table. Attendants hold him steady. The surgeon prepares his instruments: sharp bronze tools, wooden drills, and linen bandages. Perhaps the patient is given wine to dull the pain, or herbal concoctions known to calm the mind. With slow, deliberate movements, the surgeon creates a small opening in the skull, relieving pressure or removing shattered bone. The risk was great. Infection was the ever-present danger. But the rewards, to preserve life and function, were worth the peril. The surgeons of Rome were not only healers but also students of the human condition. They recorded their observations with honesty, noting both successes and failures. They understood that the brain was still a mystery, a realm only partially understood, but they had begun to unlock its secrets. Yet, alongside the growing knowledge of anatomy and surgery, the spiritual dimension persisted. In Greek and Roman culture, the mind was intimately connected to the psyche, the soul. Healing was both a physical and spiritual journey. Temples to Asclepius, the god of healing, were places where patients sought not only medical treatment but divine intervention. Rituals, prayers, and dreams were part of the healing process. The surgeon's hands were guided not just by skill but by faith. In the moments before surgery, chants might be murmured. Oils might anoint the patient's brow. The act of trepanation was, in many ways, a sacred crossing, a passage from injury toward healing, from pain toward hope. As we reflect on this ancient world, a thread weaves through the history of trepanation. From Neolithic Europe to the highlands of the Andes, from the sands of Egypt to the battlefields of Greece and Rome, a story emerges. One of human courage, of knowledge passed through generations, of a desire to touch the mind gently, to heal it, to protect it. The skull was a fortress, yes, but also a gateway. And those who dared to open it walked a narrow path, one filled with risk and promise. As the day fades over the ruins of temples and amphitheaters, we remember the hands that carved hope into bone. Hands steady, patient, and reverent. Hands that whispered to the living brain, "We will try. We will help." And in that whisper lies the quiet heart of ancient brain surgery. A story not just of cutting but of care. Not just of bones but of humanity. Far from the bustling cities and storied temples of ancient empires, in the wide and varied lands of sub-Saharan Africa, the story of trepanation quietly endures, like a soft murmur passing through generations. Here among the rolling savannas, dense forests, and ancient river valleys, The art of opening the skull did not vanish with time but was kept alive, carried gently from healer to healer, whispered in the shadowed groves where medicine and ritual met in harmonious practice. Unlike the grand historical centers of the Mediterranean or the soaring peaks of the Andes, this chapter of cranial surgery reveals a more intimate human scale, a practice woven deeply into the fabric of local communities, shaped by the land, the spirits, and the daily struggles of survival. The physical evidence lies scattered beneath the soil, resting quietly beneath centuries of dust and grass. Skulls discovered in various parts of Africa bear the unmistakable marks of trepanation. Circular openings, carefully made and smoothed by healing tissue, tell tales of hands both skilled and reverent. These were not random acts of desperation or violence but deliberate, thoughtful interventions. They speak of a knowledge passed down over time, adapted to the tools at hand and the beliefs that shaped healing. The instruments were often simple, fashioned from iron, flint, or sometimes polished glass, honed to precise edges capable of gently removing bone without shattering the fragile vessel beneath. The reasons for these surgeries varied, but often they were responses to trauma, injuries sustained in the daily risks of life, or perhaps the scars left by conflict and accident. A blow to the head could leave a person convulsing or unable to speak, lost in confusion or tormented by pain. The healer, called upon by the community, might turn to trepanation as a last hope to release pressure, to let out a harmful spirit, or to clear the way for healing to begin. But beyond the practical, many believed these surgeries were also spiritual acts, meant to free the person from invisible forces thought to dwell within the skull. In this worldview, the body and spirit were not separate but intertwined, and to heal the physical wound was also to restore the harmony of the soul. Among the Yoruba people of Nigeria, for example, detailed accounts from the 19th and 20th centuries tell of traditional healers who continued to perform cranial surgeries with great care. These healers understood the need for precision and calm, approaching each patient not simply as a body to be fixed, but as a whole being touched by both pain and hope. Their tools were sometimes passed down as family heirlooms, carefully maintained and honored as sacred instruments. The process of trepanation was slow and deliberate, carried out with a sense of ritual that calmed both patient and practitioner. Herbal mixtures might be applied to soothe pain or prevent infection, while prayers and chants wove a protective cloak of spiritual care. Similar practices were found across East Africa in the highlands of Ethiopia, where healers combined the knowledge of herbs with surgical skill, often in service of communities that lacked formal medical institutions. These surgeons were not alone in their work. They belonged to a network of knowledge keepers, elders, shamans, and midwives, who shared a holistic vision of health. Healing was not a solitary act but a communal event, involving the patient's family and community in a shared journey toward restoration. The very act of trepanation was layered with meaning, symbolizing not only physical relief but also spiritual cleansing. To open the skull was to open a pathway for new life, new breath, new balance. What is striking across these diverse regions is the remarkable similarity in technique and understanding despite vast distances and different cultures. From the sharp obsidian blades of the Andes to the bronze scalpels of Greece and the iron tools of Africa, the principle remained the same. The skull could be carefully opened to relieve pressure, to treat injury, or to engage with spiritual forces. The skull was both fortress and cage, a protector of the mind, but also, when damaged or possessed by malevolent forces, a place in need of gentle intervention. The courage required for such a practice is hard to overstate. To touch the skull is to approach the boundary between life and death, consciousness and oblivion. In these African traditions, the healer held many roles. They were surgeons, shaman, and priest all in one. Their knowledge was vast, blending anatomy, herbal medicine, and spiritual insight. The community trusted them not only to mend flesh but also to navigate the unseen world of spirits and curses. Their hands moved with the confidence of experience, but also with the humility of those who understood they were intervening in sacred territory. The patient, often surrounded by family and ritual objects, was gently guided through the ordeal, supported not just by medicine but by collective care. Interestingly, many skulls showing evidence of trepanation also bear signs of deliberate modification, elongation or other shaping, suggesting a cultural connection between cranial surgery and social or spiritual status. These altered heads may have marked individuals as leaders, healers, or beings thought to possess special wisdom or powers. Surgery on such skulls might have been reserved for the elite, or for those believed to have a unique connection to the divine. This symbolic dimension adds another layer to our understanding, showing that trepanation was not simply a medical act but one deeply embedded in cultural meaning. The endurance of trepanation into more recent centuries in parts of Africa challenges common assumptions about the history of medicine. Rather than a practice lost to the distant past, it survived and adapted, carried by oral tradition and practiced by healers deeply embedded in their communities. This continuity speaks to a profound respect for the human body and the delicate balance between the physical and spiritual realms. It reminds us that ancient wisdom is not confined to dusty tomes or archaeological sites but lives in the hearts and hands of those who keep these traditions alive. Beyond Africa, hints of trepanation appear in other parts of the world where evidence is scarcer but no less intriguing. In the islands of Polynesia, for instance, and parts of Asia, isolated findings suggest that ancient peoples explored similar methods of cranial intervention, though details remain elusive. These fragments hint at a global human curiosity about the mind and body, and a willingness to explore the boundaries of healing. Across cultures separated by oceans and mountains, a shared desire emerges: to understand, to heal, and to protect the seat of consciousness. As we stand in the quiet shadows of this ancient knowledge, the skulls themselves seem to speak. They tell stories of hands that dared to open the gateway to the mind, not in ignorance but in hope. Stories of courage in the face of pain and mystery. Of communities that nurtured both the body and the spirit. Of traditions that wove together science, faith, and compassion. These tales are soft echoes across time, inviting us to reconsider what it means to heal and what it means to know. In the end, the story of trepanation in sub-Saharan Africa and beyond is a reminder. It reminds us that medicine is never just technique, but a dance of care, courage, and connection. That healing touches not only flesh but the very essence of being. That even in places and times far from the centers of power and empire, deep wisdom and profound respect for life flourished. As the sun sets over the wide African plains and the stars begin to pierce the evening sky, we listen quietly. We hear the faint pulse of ancient knowledge, still alive in the earth, in the hands of healers, and in the stories carried on the wind. And we remember that every healed skull, every carefully made opening, is a testament to humanity's enduring quest to touch the mind gently and lovingly, to open not only the skull but the heart. As the day quietly fades into the gentle embrace of twilight, and shadows lengthen across the ancient stones and fields where history rests, we arrive at the last reflections of our journey through the enigmatic world of ancient brain surgery. The healed skulls, the worn tools, the faint traces etched by time. They invite us into a silent conversation across the ages, one that asks us to look beyond what is visible and to contemplate mysteries not easily unraveled. The practice of trepanation, this careful opening of the skull, has been found in nearly every corner of the globe. It is an enduring thread woven through the tapestry of human history, a testament to a shared human impulse, the desire to heal, to understand, and to touch the mind in all its complexity. From the windswept Andean highlands, where elongated skulls bear the marks of repeated surgeries, to the forested plains of sub-Saharan Africa, to the marble cities of ancient Greece and Rome and far beyond, the story is one of courage, knowledge, and an unyielding quest to bridge body and spirit. One cannot help but wonder about the origins of such profound knowledge. Was trepanation an accidental discovery born from trial and error, refined over generations by necessity and observation? Or was there a deeper wellspring, a lost civilization, an ancient wisdom passed quietly through secret lineages, a science intertwined with the spiritual understandings of early peoples? The skulls themselves do not answer. They simply endure, their silent testimonies provoking questions that drift softly like dust motes in a quiet room. The precision evident in these surgeries is striking. The skill with which bone was removed, the signs of healing so often present, reveal a practice far removed from the careless or cruel. It suggests a tradition, one that respected the boundaries of the human body and mind, that understood the risks and sought to minimize harm. Perhaps this knowledge was part of a wider body of learning, now obscured by time but once vibrant and alive. Could these surgeons have understood cranial pressure, the consequences of injury, and the connection between body and spirit in ways that modern science is only beginning to appreciate? Some researchers have speculated that trepanation may be a vestige of a lost race or a forgotten society, an advanced culture whose technology and wisdom far exceeded that of their contemporaries and whose knowledge faded into myth and legend. These ideas linger on the edges of mainstream history, inviting us to imagine worlds beneath the waves or buried beneath the earth where knowledge burned bright before disappearing. The recurring practice of trepanation across vastly different cultures might be more than coincidence. It might be the echo of a shared heritage or the result of early contact and exchange of knowledge long erased from our collective memory. In contemplating these possibilities, we must remember that the story of ancient brain surgery is not simply about the past. It is about the human spirit. It is about curiosity that transcends fear, about the willingness to face pain and uncertainty in the hope of healing, and about the delicate dance between knowledge and humility. Those ancient surgeons approached the mind, the seat of consciousness, with reverence and care. Their hands carved not only bone but hope. They stepped carefully across the threshold between life and death, aware of the risks, yet committed to the possibility of renewal. This enduring legacy has lessons for us today. In an age of incredible technology and rapid scientific advancement, the ancient story reminds us that healing is never solely about instruments or techniques. It is about care, connection, and respect for the complexity of life. Medicine, ancient or modern, is a blending of knowledge, empathy, and the courage to face the unknown. The trepanned skulls whisper to us about patience and precision, about listening to the body and spirit as one. Beyond the practical, the ritual dimension of trepanation remains poignant. Across cultures, surgery was never just a physical act. It was often imbued with spiritual meaning. The opening of the skull was a crossing of boundaries, the removal of evil spirits, the release of illness, or the preparation for a new stage of life. These beliefs remind us that for much of human history, body and soul were inseparable. Healing was a sacred act, woven into the fabric of culture, community, and belief. As we lay down to rest, allowing the mind to drift toward sleep, we might carry with us a sense of connection to those ancient healers. Their hands steady and sure, their hearts full of hope, their knowledge a beacon shining faintly through the mists of time. We are linked to them by a shared desire to care, to heal, and to understand. In the stillness of the night, beneath the slow turning of stars and the gentle sigh of the earth, these echoes of ancient brain surgery invite us to remember, to honor the courage of those who dared to touch the mind, who sought to ease pain and preserve life, who transformed skull and spirit with reverence and skill. Their story is, in many ways, our story, a story of enduring humanity, curiosity, and compassion. And so, as we close this chapter, let us rest in the knowledge that history is not only found in the grand monuments or great battles but in the quiet moments of care, in the hands that healed, and in the mysteries we continue to seek. The skulls with their healed openings are more than relics. They are living bridges, connecting past and present, body and soul, science and spirit. May this knowledge cradle you gently as you drift into sleep. And may the courage of those ancient surgeons inspire peaceful dreams, filled with healing and light.